Hello and welcome to my channel, or welcome back. I hope everyone is doing well. Today I am reading you 4 stories from the Haunted Canada series. If I pronounce anything wrong, I do apologize. Under the Knife, Calgary, Alberta. As the sun was beginning to set, a man entered the Riley Park Health Resource Centre, formerly the Grace Hospital. He was there to prepare for his back surgery that had been scheduled early the next morning. He hoped the procedure would bring him some relief, but the night that lay before him would be far from pain-free. As soon as he stepped into his private room, he froze in his tracks and gasped. There was a woman sitting in the chair by the bed, coolly and silently staring at him. She had long black hair and wore a white dress. The man apologized and quickly stepped back into the hall, assuming he must have accidentally walked into the wrong room. But realization slowly washed over him. He hadn't walked into another patient's room. It was the woman in white who had made the mistake. He stepped back inside, but the chair was empty. The woman was gone. Gone for the time being, that is. Deeply unsettled, the man turned out the light and slipped beneath the hospital bedsheet. Maybe he tried to convince himself he had imagined that woman. Maybe the shadows had played a trick on him. Some sort of ghostly optical illusion. He closed his eyes and, after tossing and turning, finally fell asleep. His sleep, troubled as it was, didn't last long. He woke up when someone walked into his room. The nurse, the man thought. It must be the nurse checking in on me. Muffled footsteps crossed the room. Someone sat on the bed beside him, the bed squeaking softly under the weight, and then a hand gently touched his shoulder. The man rolled over to tell the nurse he was fine, but no one was there. This happened a few more times throughout the night, completely disrupting his sleep and fraying his nerves in the process. The next morning, a nurse, a real living nurse, wheeled his bed into a larger room and told him to hold tight for a little while. 6 or 7 other patients were wheeled into the same room and lined up in a row as the hospital staff prepared for the day. "Have you seen my pen?" one of the nurses asked another. "I just had it. Maybe the ghost took it," the second nurse replied. The row of eavesdropping patients laughed, but the man scheduled for back surgery remembered the woman in white sitting in his chair. The sounds of someone entering his room and sitting on his bed, and the cold touch of phantom fingers upon his skin. He didn't join in the laughter. Neither did the nurse who had suggested that the ghost might have been responsible for the missing pen. "No, seriously," she said without a trace of humor. Her tone was grave. She then told the patients, all of whom had abruptly ceased laughing, that the hospital is haunted. A woman wanders the halls, forever in search of her baby. The woman had died in childbirth, and now things go missing all the time. The man knew then, without a shadow of doubt, that it was the grieving mother who had scared him so badly the night before. He was too shocked and upset to tell anyone what had happened to him. The nurse who worked in the Grace Hospital noticed an odd pattern over the years. Time and again, women placed in the same room where the woman had died in labor experienced very difficult deliveries that lasted much longer than most. Many resulted in cesarean sections, a surgical operation for delivering a child. The nurses came to believe that the ghost was trying to prevent other women from giving birth, perhaps in reaction to what had happened to her. Her ghost has been seen floating solemnly through the halls and has been heard opening windows and rattling the pipes. Occasionally she gets into a little more trouble. A guard was stationed in the hospital shortly after the maternity ward closed. That part of the building sat empty and unused before being repurposed, and the guard would often pass some time before the start of his shift in the room where the new mothers used to watch television. He'd been told the story of the ghost who couldn't bring herself to leave the scene of her death, but he chalked that up to the nurses telling tall tales and the other guards trying to spook him. He wasn't a believer, but he soon would be. One night the guard arrived to work early as usual. He went up to the quiet, empty television room, pulled up a chair and watched an old episode of Star Trek. When the time came for him to begin work, he turned off the TV, returned his chair, and left the room. As he walked through the halls, he started to feel a little weird. It seemed like someone was watching him, but he was certain he was alone. It was very dark, and the red light of the exit signs cast a hellish glow around him. As he continued on his way, he heard voices coming from the room at the end of the hall. The television room he approached with caution, stepped inside, and saw that someone had turned the TV back on. Someone had also pulled up the chair he had put away earlier. Casting nervous glances around the dark room, he radioed the other guard who was stationed at the desk and asked if anyone else was in the building. Just the engineer, the desk guard informed him, but the engineer was in the basement repairing something. Trying to remain calm and hoping he didn't sound too panicked, the guard explained what had happened. His colleague laughed. "Must be the ghosts having fun," he said. "Yeah, right," the guard thought. He wanted to laugh too, but he wasn't in a laughing mood. He turned off the TV, returned the chair for a second time, and tried not to look over his shoulder as he left. He could still feel eyes on his back. As he finished his patrol, the other guard radioed and told him to return to their security base immediately. He sounded anxious and scared. The guard hurried back and asked what the matter was. The desk guard pointed to the security board. A red light was flashing, indicating that someone had pushed a panic button in operating room 2, summoning security for help. The guard thought it must be some sort of joke, but his colleague said that no one else had keys to the area of the old maternity ward. Although he didn't want to, the guard had no other option but to go investigate who or what had pushed the button. He slowly entered operating room 2, not sure what he'd find. Oddly, it was empty. But there on the wall, the security button was depressed. He pressed it and it popped back out with a click. His colleague radioed to tell him the light on the security board had gone out. The guard left, trying not to give the incident much thought. Better not to dwell on something he had no logical way to explain. Not halfway back to the security base, his colleague radioed him again. Another light had turned on, this time from operating room 1. The guard didn't hesitate. He sprinted to the room and barged inside, determined, perhaps a little frantic, to discover what was going on. Like the previous room, this one was also empty. Once again, the button had been pushed in, ruling out the possibility that a short circuit had triggered the alarms. Not knowing what else to do and feeling at his wits' end, the guard stepped into the hallway. With operating room 1 behind him, operating 2 to one side, and the television room to the other, he raised his arms and pleaded with whomever might be listening and watching. "Look," he said, "I know you might feel lonely, as all the babies and mothers are gone now, and I'm sorry that you feel this way, but I have a job to do. My job is to take care of this place and keep it safe. So I'm asking you, please don't keep calling us up here. We need to do our jobs. Thank you and amen." For whatever reason, the ghost obliged the guard. As long as he worked there, the security buttons were never pressed again, but that didn't stop the phantom eyes from trailing him as he walked his rounds, forever watching him throughout the night. Buried below, Buena Vista, Newfoundland and Labrador. It had been a long, tiring day, and the old man wanted nothing more than return home, crawl into bed, and fall asleep. He drove through the night to his house near the Mockbagger Plantation, a provincial historic site in the small town of Buena Vista, and pulled into his driveway. He killed the car's ignition, and all was quiet and calm. Wearily he stepped out of the car and approached his front gate. At the same moment that he opened it, someone opened the door of his enclosed porch. The old man froze. He couldn't see anyone on the porch or in the yard. The only sound were the crashing of ocean waves on the nearby shore and the insects buzzing in the grass around the house. He slowly closed the gate. The porch door swung shut as well. After taking a moment to steel his nerve, the old man crossed the lawn and opened the porch door. The front door of his house followed suit. He closed the porch door behind him, and as before, the front door closed. The old man opened the front door and stepped inside, still unable to fathom what was happening. He watched as the kitchen door creaked open slowly. And then he heard footsteps going up the stairs. Knowing that his wife would be asleep in their bedroom and fearful that she was in trouble, the man raced upstairs and barged into their room. He didn't pass anyone on the stairs or in the hall. His wife, alone in the bedroom, sat up in bed with a start. Before she could ask him what was wrong, he demanded to know if she had heard anyone climbing the stairs a moment ago. "Yes," she said, a slight tremor creeping into her voice. "I thought it was you." And then, loud at first but slowly fading, they heard the same footsteps walking back down the stairs. This bizarre and unnerving phenomenon occurred on several more occasions. One day in the spring, the old man was doing some renovations and digging on his property when his shovel hit something solid. Something the man never would have expected to discover. Buried deep beneath his house's foundation was a casket. He and his wife had been living for years above a dead body. Once the casket was removed, his doors stopped opening and closing on their own, and the couple never heard phantom footsteps going up and down the stairs again. In any other town, finding a casket buried under your house would be completely unusual, but Bonavista is not any other town. When a canal was dug in the 1920s, the construction crew discovered a number of unmarked coffins buried in the mud. More coffins were unearthed during the construction of the bridge in 1946. The caskets were pried open and the remains of men, women, and children were found inside. They were dressed in European-style clothing, and the wood of the coffins was not native to Newfoundland. Experts believe the caskets predate 1725, the year the first cemetery was built in Bonavista. Where did the coffins come from? Why were they buried in Bonavista? And who were the people left to rot beneath the homes that would later be built above them? Some believe the deceased must have been early French settlers, since many men came from France to fish the Newfoundland coast. Others discredit this theory because French fishermen did not bring their wives or children to Canada. It remains one of the great mysteries of Canada's past, and it's a decidedly macabre mystery to boot. Whoever they were and however they ended up in their final resting place, the spirits of the departed have not gone quietly into the night. It's not uncommon for people to hear the lifting voices of men and women singing in a foreign language, carried by the midnight wind from the burial grounds where the coffins were discovered. The Spirit of the Cathedral, Quebec City, Quebec. Loud, triumphant music poured from the Cathedral of the Holy Trinity's celebrated organ, filling the building from its pews and its domed ceiling. There was only one man in the church, the organist, and he was concentrating so hard as he practiced his music that he didn't hear the sound of approaching footsteps. When he did hear someone approaching, he stopped playing and spun around. The echoes of his music faded to silence. He picked up his sheet music, stood up, and peered around the church. Although he could only hear the footsteps getting closer, 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 he couldn't see a soul. The footsteps grew louder and suddenly stopped to the organist's left. Then the source of the disturbance materialized before his eyes. A woman wearing an old-fashioned dress and hat appeared in front of one of the church's stained glass windows. Cold sweat trickled into the man's eyes, and he could barely breathe. Before he could do anything, the woman disappeared. A moment later, the organ began blaring an angry sound and reverberated through the air. The organist dropped his sheet music in terror, and as he fled from his instrument and the phantom that was playing it, the blaring turned into a melodic tune, not unlike the one the organist had been playing only a minute or two before. Many have seen the spirit of the cathedral. She has frightened disturbed organists and churchgoers alike from the sound of her hollow footfalls and tearful moans. Who is she, or rather was, is a bit of a mystery, but it's widely believed that she is one of two women who have deadly ties to the cathedral's early days. The Cathedral of the Holy Trinity, the first Anglican cathedral to be built outside the British Isles, was constructed shortly before a cholera epidemic swept through Quebec City. In June of 1832, a few feverish passengers disembarked a ship that had traveled from Ireland to Quebec, and the first known fatality occurred soon after. Within a few short days, cholera had spread to Montreal and into Upper Canada. Suddenly, hundreds were dying every day. Doctors were overwhelmed with patients and officials to extreme. Desperate measures to try to stop the disease from spreading further. Officers fired cannons and the sanitary office burned to tar in an attempt to cleanse the air. Iris Dillon lived near the church and in great fear, as scared as she was as the disease that was killing her. Neighbors and friends, she was even more afraid that she would somehow end up buried alive. Iris suffered from narcolepsy and neurological disorder that causes people to fall into deep slumbers from which they cannot be roused. Tragically, Iris's greatest fear came true. A neighbor found her in a narcoleptic state, and when she could not wake her, thought she was dead and alerted the authorities. During the epidemic, bodies were dealt with swiftly, without prayer or ceremony, and it's believed Iris was buried alive in the church's cemetery during construction 50 years later. A workman dug up human remains believed to belong to Iris Dillon, who might be the ghost of the cathedral. The second possibility is a young woman who, approximately 30 years after the cholera epidemic, gave birth to a baby out of wedlock. This was gravely frowned upon in the 1860s, and both women and her newborn became social outcasts. Unable to provide for her child and convinced she had no other options, the woman made a horrible decision. Late one night, she suffocated her baby with a pillow, crept into the cathedral's basement, and buried the small body in the ground beside the remains of entombed bishops. It's rumored that there's a small unmarked grave in the cathedral's basement directly beneath the position of the organ. Some organists have reported that placing toys on the grave has allowed them to practice without the ghostly woman disturbing them. It's believed the young mother, guilt-ridden over horrific actions, haunts the church seeking forgiveness for the crime she committed more than 150 years ago. Whether the ghost is a woman who was buried alive or a woman who killed her own child, she's unable to find solace and move on. The cathedral is one of the ghost tours of Quebec's main stops, and at least one of the leaders have encountered the ghost on separate occasions. Laurie Thatcher was speaking to a group one night when she saw the ghost standing on the second-floor balcony near the organ. Sweat poured down Laurie's face, and her heart pounded against her ribcage. She wanted out of the church immediately. Another night, a different guide had an odd sensation that she was being watched from behind while she spoke to a group. Shaking the filling off, she retrieved her lantern, which had set on a table behind her, and noticed that not only had the light gone out, but the candle had disappeared entirely. Confused and a little shaken, the guide wondered aloud what had happened to the candle. A man on the tour then told her he had seen a shadowy figure standing near the lantern as she spoke. It seems nothing will bring the spirit any peace, for she still haunts the cathedral today, playing the organ and terrifying people. Army of the Dead, Louisbourg, Nova Scotia. The midnight afternoon sun sparkled across the water of Louisbourg Harbor and warmed the backs of the assembled tourists, giving the tour leader no reason to expect anything sinister lay in wait beyond the chapel door. Beckoning the group to follow her as she recounted historical tales of what life was like in the fortress of Louisbourg during the 1700s, the guide opened the door and stepped inside. She had expected the chapel to be empty. It wasn't. A man in period clothing was kneeling at the altar, weeping loudly and shouting in French. That's odd, thought the guide. There weren't supposed to be any reenactors or animators in the church. Thanks to restoration efforts by Parks Canada and the Fortress Louisbourg Association, the fortress has been rebuilt by archaeologists, and the streets were filled during the summer months with animators, people portraying the rich and the poor, the old and the young, exactly as people lived in 1744. But the church at the time of day was supposed to be empty. The guide did her best to pretend the crying man was a planned part of the tour and carried on spinning tales of the founding of the fortress in 1713 by the French. of its heyday as a thriving fishing settlement and of its eventual destruction in the 1760s at the hands of the British. But the man continued cursing and crying with equal amounts of anger and sorrow, and the guide had to shout to be heard over the racket. Despite her best efforts to remain calm, she lost her train of thought and finally snapped. She turned to the man at the altar and shouted at him, demanding to know what exactly he was supposed to be reenacting. The tour guide didn't receive a response, but her group of tourists looked at one another in shock and asked each other why their guide was shouting at an empty altar. The guide was the only person who could see and hear him. The fortress of Louisbourg is haunted by an army of the dead, the spirits of soldiers and settlers who lived there long ago. These ghosts, like the men shouting in French in the chapel, are regularly mistaken for the living, breathing animators who recreate history for the visitors of this National Historic Site. In October, guides lead nighttime tours through the streets of the fortress. It's so large that it includes 3 authentic 18th century restaurants where stew simmers over open flames, a parlor where women lead dancing demonstrations, the King's Bakery with its delectable aroma of fresh-baked bread, and army barracks where the ground shakes from the firing of the fortress cannon. It's so real, fortress staff say, seems surreal. Surreal is a very apt choice of word. On cold autumn nights, the only light comes from the moon, candles lit in windows and lanterns carried by the guides. They share some of the more unsettling and morbid stories that have been reported over the years. At the end of a long, busy night, a guide noticed a candle still burning in one of the barracks windows. She entered the building to blow out the candle, but was surprised to find a soldier sitting beside the flickering light. Startled, she breathlessly said, "You'd better hurry up and get changed. The bus is about to leave." She then blew out the candle and quickly left. The man didn't answer or follow her out. After exiting the barracks, she told the bus driver to wait for the final animator. Everyone on the bus asked her who she was talking about. "There's still a soldier up there getting changed," she replied. The first hints of unease creeping in her voice. "I just spoke to him." The military supervisor looked at her gravely and informed her everyone was ready on the bus. The last person had left the barracks 10 minutes ago. There was no one living inside the barracks. Sometimes the animators spend the entire weekend inside the fortress to fully submerge themselves into the lives of those who lived there during the 1700s. During one such encampment, an animator who was portraying a member of the French militia was sleeping in the Chevalier house. In the middle of the night, she awoke to see 3 men in British uniforms and 1 First Nations man standing in the large room where others were also sleeping. She assumed the 4 strangers were fellow animators who had entered the building to find a friend, and she rolled over and let herself drift back to sleep. But in the morning, when she described the 4 men and asked who they were, the British animators shared wide-eyed looks and informed her that they didn't have any uniforms in that style she had seen, nor was there a First Nations man with them. Furthermore, they all insisted that no one in their party had visited the Chevalier house during the night. Perhaps the creepiest house on the property is the Duhaget home. Captain Duhaget built the house for his wife and the children they hoped to fill it with. Unfortunately, they were unable to conceive a baby, and the captain fell into poor health and died, leaving the wife a widow in the empty home. It's believed the captain couldn't hear the thought of his wife being left alone without children for company, so he took it upon himself to return after death. When the Duhaget house was being updated for modern-day visitors, the exhibit designer was alone when he saw a uniformed man walk past the stairwell. The stranger's costume was remarkably realistic, particularly his coat. When the exhibit designer later visited the costume department, he told them how impressed he was with the uniforms they had created. Unable to contain her puzzlement, the costume designer informed the man that they did not have any coats in their collection to match his description, and the animators hadn't arrived at the fortress yet. The man could think of only one explanation. He had seen the ghost of Duhaget, and that's why the coat had looked so authentic. As chilling as the realization that he had seen a ghost was for the poor exhibit designer, perhaps he'd find comfort in the knowledge that Captain Duhaiget's ghost seems to be more concerned with protecting guests in his home than terrifying them. One day when a guide was descending the back stairs, she tripped on the carpet and fell. She would have been seriously injured if not for an invisible hand that reached out of thin air and grabbed her by the shoulder, holding her upright and preventing her from tumbling down to what might have been an early grave. So real, it's surreal, indeed. Set foot in the fortress of Louisbourg, and you might find yourself marching with the army of the dead. Thank you for listening. If you like this type of content, please consider subscribing and liking to my channel, and I will see you on the next one.